There were periods when violence was not the exception, but the rule. The dead were not counted by individual names, but by entire villages, tribes, even peoples erased from the map. This is one of the chilling yet sober opening pages of the book The Better Angels of Our Nature by Steven Pinker, a thinker who refused to be complacent with simplistic notions of human kindness. Not everyone dares to confront the raw statistics of murder rates in primitive societies, with candid descriptions of live human sacrifices, blood-chilling laws, and forgotten deaths serving merely as warnings. Not everyone is ready to put themselves in the shoes of ancient peoples, to ask why a civilization could once celebrate torture and public execution as a joyous communal event without a hint of doubt. So what allowed humanity to navigate thousands of years steeped in darkness and gradually find a path to light? This question isn't just for historians, but for anyone who has ever felt a chill of unease reading a news report about an act of violence, a war, or an uncompromising act of revenge. Does the darker side of human nature always lie in wait, ready to emerge? Or has another current, silent, patient, and persistent, gradually transformed the very essence of this world? What if the horrors of history were precisely the conditions that taught humanity to be more compassionate towards one another? To empathize and to feel shame? If today people still feel helpless in the face of brutality, could it be simply because they lack the courage to look directly into the past? The Better Angels of Our Nature doesn't offer definitive answers, but invites readers to re-examine history and themselves. Because sometimes, what we fear most is precisely what we need to confront most directly. Humanity's past is an alien landscape, a place where the darkness of violence didn't hide, but wore the cloak of everyday life with indifference. The story begins with the mummified remains of a man found in the Tyrolean ice. The bronze axe beside him wasn't an ornament, but a symbol of an era ready to shed blood for survival. The arrowhead still lodged in his shoulder blade speaks 1,000 words about the fate of ancient peoples. Each time archaeologists unearth a skeleton, few escape the marks of injuries, slaughter, or departures never returned from, driven by hatred and retribution. A peaceful dream never existed for those who wandered through primitive history. Even when one's gaze falls upon the verses of the asterisk Iliad or the body-strewn legends of Greece, the most astonishing thing is the sheer naturalness of taking another's life. No one questioned why men were killed, women abducted, cities engulfed in flames. No one was surprised by a moment of collective massacre that ended with the cheers of the survivors. Expanding beyond the mythical world, the stories of the Bible unveil a no less brutal horizon, where God's punishment plunged humanity into a flood, killing even children and women, to teach mankind a lesson in obedience and the ruthlessness of ancient justice. When discussing the first legal codes, history records that no civilization, from Babylon to Egypt, Rome, or China, lacked bloodthirsty punishments erected as milestones for order and power. Cutting off hands, flaying, crucifixion, poisoning, burning alive. Such practices were once vivid proof of the ancient world's perennial insecurity. Throughout history's journey, the normalcy of violence became the thread connecting civilizations, regardless of east or west, north or south. Sacrificing lives, paying with blood, ancient peoples saw this not as a catastrophe but merely as a rule for survival. From the fierce battles of Rome, the public punishments in medieval Europe, to executions in the town square, these spectacles were once attended by adults with children, like a festival. Blood flowing, heads falling, was not an unforeseen outcome, but precisely what people expected to reinforce the order and authority of the powerful. Beyond the legends of kings and conquerors, famed generals always went hand in hand with blood-soaked epics. History relentlessly boasted of the Roman Empire's cruel victories, slaughtering tens of thousands, burning down villages, enslaving populations. Or the image of feudal lords commanding soldiers to kill and burn everything, leaving no one behind. In a world without cameras, without newspapers to record every drop of blood, mass death sometimes became just a fleeting statistic lost among the gilded pages of history. At times, one might wonder if violence was such an inherent, vital breath of ancient society that it no longer concerned anyone with pain, loss, or the boundary between right and wrong, good and evil. Surveys of mortality rates from war and violence in stateless communities show that the probability of a person being killed by a fellow human in primitive societies was many times higher than in the modern world. These cold numbers do not lie, nor do they bend to emotion along humanity's barren paths. Every trace of history is saturated with the fear of sudden attack, the anxiety of mutual revenge, a constant unease in every glance, every whispered word at night. Stabbings in villages, endless feuds between clans, laws permitting punishment by flogging, hand-chopping, eye-gouging, these were not exceptions, but the very core of social function. Yet, the further we move away from that suffocating atmosphere, the more unbelievable history becomes to modern people. No one remembers the whip that once hung in their parents' home as an everyday object. No one can imagine a wife being beaten in the market, a thief executed amidst cheering crowds. The brutality that was once normalized now makes people shudder, unable to believe it ever existed. In this relentless current, the memory of a grim and savage past serves as a mirror reflecting the question: have humans truly changed, or are these merely layers of civilized veneer covering instincts still waiting for a chance to reemerge? We cannot answer hastily before completing the rest of the journey. But time did not stand still. Beneath the dusty veil of continuous massacres, the seeds of transformation gradually permeated communities, like a small stream seeping through a crack in the most stubborn rock. As humans began to gather in larger groups, as small hamlets expanded into ordered territories, the concept of centralized power emerged. The nascent state didn't arise from lofty ideals, but from the very need to hold the blade of individual violence in a hand strong enough to compel obedience. People feared endless clan feuds, feared generations-old grudges, feared even the watchful eyes of strangers lurking at the village's edge. A power structure emerged, initially tribal chiefs, later kings, and royal courts with soldiers and mandarins. Under the aegis of this power, killings suddenly became less frequent. Not because anyone suddenly became kinder, but because they knew that spontaneous violence would be met with a greater, colder, and more organized violence. The state, however rudimentary, set new limits. No one was permitted to kill indiscriminately if they didn't want to become an enemy of the common power. Statistics comparing stateless tribal societies with early civilizations like ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and China clearly show a significant decrease in violence-related mortality rates. Even during the bloodiest periods of feudal dynasties, the death toll from killings was far lower than the incessant tribal warfare among hunter-gatherer societies. State legal regulations and punishment systems, though harsh, created a less violent space for the majority. What's noteworthy is that the essence of this process wasn't that humans suddenly became benevolent, but rather that they learned to fear collective power, to calculate long-term benefits, and to curb their impulsive selves to avoid punishment. No more generational blood feuds between clans, no more resolving disagreements with swords. The state, whether led by a tribal chief, a pharaoh, an emperor, or a feudal king, assumed a monopoly on violence, transforming homicide into something reserved only for those who dared to challenge the central order. There were moments in history when the iron discipline of centralized power pulled humanity out of the endless cycle of vengeance. The fear of losing one's life, possessions, or family no longer lurked daily as before. It was also from this point that trade and the exchange of goods began to flourish. As trust and order was consolidated, people dared to leave their familiar shelters, travel further, meet more people, and expand relationships with strangers whom they previously would have certainly viewed with suspicion. The decline of violence did not happen overnight. Sometimes, history resembles a winding river, with sections of rushing current and others flowing calmly. There were still rebellions, assassinations, and dynasties collapsing due to the very blood of kings who once embodied power. Yet, compared to the vague memories of hunter-gatherer times, this new world gradually became more predictable, safer for the majority of its inhabitants. People began to look beyond petty disputes. They gradually became aware of the value of stability, of peace, even if sometimes the price was bowing before a power greater than themselves. Sociology gradually emerged in this context. Social stratification, hierarchical systems, communication customs, and the art of conduct were all standardized, reinforced by laws and new forms of punishment. Each individual in the community understood that disagreements should not always be resolved by force. Of course, violence did not disappear entirely, but being controlled by a sufficiently strong institution meant it was no longer the sole option, nor the first choice, once the state was robust enough. Desires for revenge and old enmities were gradually overshadowed by a new fear: the fear of being condemned by the entire community, punished by law, and stripped of the right to live within the common order. With each such transformation, the world gradually opened up a new horizon before humanity, where stability and predictability became core values, where each person could begin to think more about the future, about the consequences of their actions, about their relationship with a larger community rather than just their tribe or small family. It was in this context that the first seeds of social morality and self-control began to form. Though not yet clear, it was enough to slow the frenzied rhythm of violence that had dominated the entirety of human history. And it was from there that history's footsteps delved deeper into a phase called the civilizing process. Not everyone realized it, but as the world developed, expressions of violence were increasingly hidden beneath new layers of social life. Violence was no longer a display of prowess in broad daylight. It began to be considered shameful, something to be concealed or tightly controlled. This was when society created invisible barriers, where everyone understood that impulsive actions could lead to long-term consequences far beyond a moment of rashness. Social order became more complex. Laws were no longer simply to protect the strong, but aimed at fairness, protecting even the vulnerable. Public arenas gradually gave way to courtrooms, where reason slowly overtook the shouts of the crowd. Barbaric forms of punishment, once the identity of an era, were now gradually abolished by society, not because anyone felt sorrow, but because they began to believe in the value of moderation, control, and benevolence. Simultaneously, commercial economies and complex trade networks gradually extended relationships between people. When someone understood that their self-interest depended on cooperation with others, they were forced to adjust their behavior, training themselves to restrain their violent instincts. A successful merchant could no longer maintain the mindset of a warrior living by plunder. The cost of a single outburst of anger could be the loss of everything, not just property, but also one's standing in the community. It was trade and the continuous flow of goods that sowed a new belief in people's hearts. To prosper, one must live in peace. Not just stopping at external institutions, the civilizing process also subtly formed an internal policing system within each individual. Humans learned to self-monitor emotions, control impulses, and weigh the consequences of every word and action. From this, concepts like honor, self-respect, shame, and respect for others' rights began to be reinforced. No one arbitrarily wielded the hammer of judgment against others anymore. Even fewer dared to inflict savage punishments under the community's gaze. Violence gradually transformed into something unacceptable, becoming a sign of inferiority, ignorance, of someone unable to control themselves. In this new culture, public executions were considered a blemish to be hidden. Barbaric death sentences were gradually abolished. Bloody festivals faded, giving way to gentle values of persuasion and dialogue. Somewhere, those screams still echoed in the night and murders still occurred. The power of the community and the new order created an invisible golden circlet, slowly tightening around everything that belonged to the age of savagery. Most evident was the change in the art of conduct and daily communication. Codes of conduct gradually formed. Everyone knew they had to save face, restrain emotions in public, and respect the rights of others, regardless of their status. Ancient letters, diaries, and etiquette books bear witness to this. The emergence of table manners and conversational styles are all evidence of a society that increasingly valued emotional control and mutual respect. At this point, a paradox emerged. The less violence there was, the more sensitive people became to even the slightest manifestations of crudeness. What was once normal in the past now became unforgivable. A punch, an insult, a loss of control, once common occurrences, now became subjects of outrage, condemned by the community and subject to legal intervention. Civilization didn't completely eradicate the shadow of violence, but it transformed it into something alien, unacceptable, something that couldn't long endure in modern society. Thus, new layers of social history formed. New values emerged, creating a world vastly different from the dark lands humanity once roamed. Yet, if one looks closely into every hidden corner, one can still feel the breath of that distant past, as a reminder that to achieve a civilized and stable society, humans traversed paths full of darkness, where even a glance could be a command leading to death. And it is this transformation that is the greatest miracle history has bestowed upon humanity. There were historical moments that felt like an awakening from a long stupor of violence. From ancient Europe echoed the voices of those who dared to question seemingly immutable truths, who dared to delve into the pain that generation after generation had stoically endured. As the humanist wave rose, society began to confront its own dark corners, where torture, execution, and public punishment were once rituals of power, a means for the strong to drown the weak in hopeless screams. Death sentences, executions in public squares, the cries of those beheaded, burned alive, or hanged were once the haunting nightmares of every community. But the current of history did not stop there. The emergence of people who dared to think differently, who dared to speak up for human value, created the first cracks in the cold stone of tradition. Pamphlets, debates in the shadowy corners of cafes all gradually formed a powerful network for spreading ideas, shaking the very foundations of power's castles. As people read about the suffering of others, they began to question themselves about the limits of what was called justice. New ideas were not merely abstract theories. Alongside scientific advancements, explorations of the world and human nature led society to no longer blindly trust violence as destiny. Thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Beccaria, in turn, exposed the consequences, absurdity, and cruelty of barbaric forms of punishment. The idea of human rights did not come from a miracle, but was the result of struggle, of sleepless nights, of years lived in fear of being labeled a heretic. The human rights revolution truly erupted when nations began to amend laws, gradually eliminating torture and abolishing public death penalties. The change didn't happen uniformly, but as one nation cut its chains, another lowered its blade, the wave spread endlessly. Slavery was no longer taken for granted. Dueling was seen as a remnant. Public executions gradually receded into the shadows of history. Society began to realize that a strong community was built not on the cruelty of its rulers, but on compassion and the ability to protect human dignity. This mindset spread with the growth of knowledge. As printed books proliferated and letters crossed all geographical boundaries, human empathy expanded even to those never met. The notion of a shared humanity, of the universal value of freedom and the right to life, had its first chance to take root and flourish. Looking back at that era, it is clear that true power lay not in spears and swords, but in fragile pages that dared to speak the truth. Change was never easy. Every reform was met with opposition, scorn, and was seen as an act of the weak. But reality proved that the more a society eliminated torture and limited violence, the more prosperous and sustainable it became. Human history was no longer just the story of the powerful using force to control everything. Now, it had become a journey in search of compassion, tolerance, and responsibility towards others. The atmosphere of change spread powerfully beyond national borders and cultural boundaries. Humanitarian values, mercy, and the aspiration for equality gradually became common assets, no longer confined to small groups or privileged classes. The true strength of a society lies not in its ability to instill fear, but in its capacity to render that fear meaningless. History seemed to veer onto an old, familiar path. But then, once again, the power of new ideas stirred the order. War was once destiny, bloodshed the inevitable price of every conflict. In the 20th century, humanity believed it had hit rock bottom of brutality with 2 world wars that shattered every proud achievement. Each ruined city, each devastated nation, was a painful, indelible mark. But it was precisely from those ashes that people suddenly realized something unprecedented in thousands of years of history among great nations. After all was said and done, they knew how to stop, how to restrain themselves, how to hold their breath at the brink without plunging into annihilation again. International organizations were established not just as meeting places, but as shields against the urge for conflict. The United Nations, mutual defense treaties, endless diplomatic conferences all were born from the fear of war and a genuine yearning for peace. People began to realize that a nation's true power lay not in its guns, but in its ability to persuade, in the interlocking of interests, in strong economic networks that bound the fate of the powerful with the weak. In this current, the market economy became the glue connecting nations, making every conflict a wound no one wished to bear. International war statistics rapidly declined, the sight of great empires constantly tearing each other apart, as in previous centuries, vanished. Science advanced, weapons of mass destruction emerged. But it was the sheer terror from Hiroshima and Nagasaki that became the final wall, preventing any hand from pressing the button of destruction. Researchers, looking at the graph of war mortality rates, noted a sudden drop after 1945. Not only did the number of deaths decrease, but the very nature of war also changed. Instead of total wars, the world shifted to smaller, more sporadic conflicts, less likely to escalate into major catastrophes. The instinct for destruction still remained, but was tightly chained by diplomacy, economic alliances, and the increasingly powerful voice of the international community. Civil wars, ethnic conflicts, and genocides still occurred, but with a difference. Now, no act of brutality could take place in absolute silence. Media outlets, international organizations, and global human rights movements all became sleepless eyes, illuminating every hidden corner. What was once a national secret, hidden in darkness, now had to be exposed to the entire world. Of course, no one naively believes that violence has completely vanished, but the truth is that humanity has taken a huge step forward in taming its own destructive instincts. It is no longer acceptable for rulers to easily dispatch armies for conquest. Massacres are no longer considered private affairs. No one dares to ignore the cries for help from trampled small lands. Every decision to use violence now faces a wave of protest, condemnation, and sanctions from the international community. Explaining this change, the role of the global economy cannot be overlooked. When a currency can move across many countries in an instant, when a common market becomes the vital foundation of all economies, anyone who instigates war pays a price not only in blood, but also in backwardness, isolation, and poverty. The market economy, seemingly cold, is paradoxically the most enduring machine protecting peace. No one dares to break the central order merely to satisfy a temporary lust for power. Especially, the power of democracy and modern social movements has changed the very perception of violence as the voice of each individual is heard, as freedom is protected by law and civil society. No government can arbitrarily decide the lives of millions without being accountable to public opinion. The memories of great wars, concentration camps, and genocides of the last century are precisely the cautionary lessons that make everyone wary whenever the notion of violence sparks. In the light of the new century, violence is no longer a solution but a sign of failure, of powerlessness against the strength of persuasion, diplomacy, and empathy. What seemed paradoxical has become the truth of our age. True power no longer lies in cannons, but in the ability to preserve peace. The modern world, despite its hotspots, is moving towards a future where gunshots give way to dialogue, where war is no longer the only way to resolve disputes. As the cannons fall silent, people quietly realize there are deep cuts that don't need a sword, lingering wounds existing beneath the guise of peace. Violence isn't just conflict on borders or bloodshed on battlefields. It permeates every room, every relationship, unwritten biases, and small but persistent injustices. That's when society confronts a new enemy, one without a concrete form but interwoven into daily life: oppression, discrimination, indifference to the suffering of the weak. The first voices raised may not have been as resounding as battle commands of old, but they struck at the old foundations of power. Movements for equality began with the courage of silent individuals, marginalized groups, and communities once trampled under the guise of tradition or law. They didn't use violence to counter violence, but chose the path of patiently expanding the limits of empathy. From the right to bodily autonomy, the right to education, to the right to be loved and to be proud of oneself, each demand broke another link in the chain of social subjugation. As human rights laws gradually integrated into daily life, a fresher air began to seep into every corner. Children were no longer property to be disposed of. Women were no longer confined within four walls. LGBTQ+ individuals no longer lived in fear and shame. Laws were rewritten not just on paper, but in how society perceived and treated people. Every voice was heard. Every life held equal value, regardless of location, skin color, or belief. But it didn't stop there. The circle of empathy continued to expand towards new frontiers of social consciousness. Many for the first time questioned the fate of voiceless creatures, the right of animals to live without pain, and humanity's duty to the surrounding environment. Animal protection and nature conservation movements arose not just out of compassion, but also from recognizing the link between individual happiness and collective responsibility. A truly civilized society is one where all beings are treated fairly. From these relentless efforts, new concepts were born. Violence was not just a bruise on the skin, but also mocking words, discrimination in a glance, the silent anxiety of entering a room full of strangers. Each time society re-examined itself, moral standards were adjusted, old boundaries blurred, and paths opened for the growth of compassion and mutual respect. Looking back, each generation carries the imprint of its era. From the bloody days on battlefields, through human rights revolutions, to the quiet transformations of daily life. Change is sometimes silent, sometimes bursts forth in seemingly ordinary moments. It could be a child daring to speak up to protect a friend from bullying, a woman daring to refuse a predetermined fate, or a small community daring to organize a march for equal rights. Each of these actions, however small, is a continuing link in the never-ending process of civilization. Throughout this process, society learned to reevaluate everything once taken for granted. No one dared to disregard another's pain simply because they were different. No one dismissed words that could leave scars on the heart as empathy spread. The invisible barriers that once divided communities gradually blurred. That was when people began to live not just for themselves, but for the larger community as well. Some changes come very slowly. It takes many years to look back and recognize them. But little by little, the world became more tolerant, more humane. Strength was no longer the ability to impose one's will on others, but the capacity to listen, share, and protect each other. Violence was gradually pushed out of public life, giving way to soft yet enduring values: trust, understanding, the readiness to forgive, and the protection of the vulnerable. The circle of empathy continuously expanded. What was once unimaginable in the past became the norm of the present. Society learned to feel shame for even the smallest injustices. It learned to self-correct whenever someone was hurt. No one was a bystander to another's pain anymore. This is vivid proof of humanity's root-transforming power. A power that comes not from violence, but from the courage to confront darkness and the relentless will to reach for the light of civilization. There's one truth not everyone dares to confront. Beneath the shiny veneer of civilization, in the deepest recesses of the human soul, unerasable shadows still exist. This is where primordial impulses lie dormant, ready to surge forth at any opportune moment. People often mistakenly believe that violence is solely a product of society or circumstance, but the truth can sometimes be much colder. Cruelty, the thirst for power, unbridled rage, the pleasure derived from witnessing others' pain are inseparable parts of humanity's evolutionary heritage. There are urges that don't stem from reason but from distant corners of genetic memory. The desire for revenge when insulted, the craving for possession, the will to dominate, extreme beliefs. All are like powerful undercurrents beneath a calm exterior. Science has shown that certain brain regions are always poised to signal violent action when humans feel threatened or offended. These are remnants of the hunter-gatherer era, an age where every danger could be a matter of survival. Actions that seem inexplicable actually have their own instinctive logic. Retaliation was once the only way to protect honor, fight enemies, and deter those who sought to provoke. The desire to dominate brought a sense of control over the world, a feeling of security within the group. Sometimes, the pleasure in others' pain was an expression of ultimate power, a way to demonstrate one's strength before a crowd. These emotions are neither spontaneously generated nor easily extinguished. Violence is also fueled by religious notions. Belief systems can transform hatred into a sacred mission. Many wars, many bloody massacres throughout history, were ignited by the conviction that one possessed absolute truth, that annihilating others is a noble duty. Tribal instincts persist, causing people to distrust, fear, and hate what is different, and to readily act to defend imaginary boundaries. Not just limited to individuals, modern society can still transform these impulses into movements, into collective power, ethnic and religious conflicts, extremist trends, mob violence. All are testaments to the enduring shadow within each human being. The story of violence is never just a tale from the distant past. It always lurks nearby, awaiting only a pretext, a sufficient condition to erupt into action. Neuroscience and evolutionary psychology both indicate that no one is born entirely harmless. Within each person, there is always a part ready to resist, rebel, and seek revenge. No matter how advanced education, law, and social norms become, these primal drives can still resurface when people feel cornered, or when their honor or interests are threatened. Criminals, dictators, terrorists are not strange beings, but extreme manifestations of impulses that exist in all of us. Uncontrolled emotions, the desire to possess, erupting anger, all are the legacy of millions of years of evolution, where survival meant defending oneself at all costs. History is filled with examples of individuals and groups who sacrificed everything just to cling to an idea of power, a concept of honor, a fleeting moment of pleasure. Deep beneath all civilized achievements lie layers upon layers of savage impulses, always seeking to tear through the fragile veneer of social order. There were times when humans glorified violence as a proud quality. Battles, vendettas, public executions were all seen as expressions of strength and courage. But the deeper one delves into psychology, the more one uncovers the secrets of the brain, the more one realizes the danger of letting these impulses freely dictate actions. No one is entirely immune to darkness. The only difference lies in who controls them and who lets them be controlled. Looking at the reality of modern life, the shadow of violence still permeates every street corner, every family story, every petty dispute, arguments, brawls, bullying, trivial acts of revenge. All are manifestations of primordial impulses that have not been fully subdued. Behind every seemingly meaningless act lies an underground current stretching back from the distant past, where humans were small creatures in a world fraught with danger. And no matter how much society changes, no one can be sure they have escaped that persistent shadow. Darkness is not the whole story. If humans only carried destructive impulses, history would have ended long ago. Alongside these primordial urges, within each person exist silent but persistent counterforces. These are what pulled humanity out of the spiral of destruction, one resolute step at a time. The first driving force is empathy, not a weak emotion as many once mistakenly believed, but a powerful capacity that allows humans to feel the pain of others as their own. When someone sees another hurting and feels an urge to alleviate that pain, it's not weakness but the foundation of all forms of cooperation. Empathy expands the boundaries of us, making strangers no longer entirely anonymous and making violence psychologically harder to commit. Alongside empathy is self-control. Humans don't just live by momentary impulses. They can pause, think about consequences, weigh short-term benefits against long-term losses. Self-control doesn't eliminate desires but frames them. This capacity allows anger to be held in silence, a violent act to be replaced by patience, a conflict to be resolved with words instead of fists. Morality is also a key force. It's not rigid external rules imposed upon us, but a system of standards accumulated and passed down by society across generations. Rules of right and wrong, fairness, responsibility, and duty form an invisible boundary that no one easily crosses. Morality can be exploited, distorted, but in its most developed form, it becomes an effective tool for limiting violence, as it makes people feel shame and remorse when harming others. Reason is an indispensable pillar in this picture. The ability to rationalize allows humans to escape their narrow self-perspective, to see the world from multiple angles, and to recognize the internal contradictions in violent behavior. Reason shows that revenge doesn't bring lasting safety, that cooperation yields greater benefits than confrontation, that a stable society offers better opportunities for all. When reason is nurtured, violence is no longer the obvious solution, but becomes an inefficient choice. These forces don't grow stronger naturally. They are nurtured by education, by family, by the social environment, and by legal institutions. Children learn self-restraint when adults set examples. Citizens learn respect when laws are justly enforced. Empathy spreads when others' stories are told and heard. Each generation contributes a small part to making these forces stronger and more sustainable. There is no absolute confrontation between darkness and light. They coexist within the same human, the same society. At times, violent impulses prevail. At times, restraining forces regain control. The decisive factor is not a fixed nature, but circumstances, institutions, and choices repeatedly made over time. When looking at less violent societies, the common thread isn't that people there are inherently better, but that positive forces are encouraged, while destructive impulses are constrained. Empathy is expanded through education and media. Self-control is cultivated through personal and social discipline. Morality is strengthened by shared norms. Reason is respected as a problem-solving tool. It is this fragile balance that creates progress. No angel completely triumphs, nor is any demon permanently vanquished. But when positive forces are strong enough, violence is pushed to the margins, becoming a rare and shameful occurrence rather than the center of life. That is the state humanity has gradually achieved, not through magic, but through the slow accumulation of understanding, discipline, and the courage to confront oneself. Human history is not a continuously upward trajectory. What has been achieved today is constantly challenged by unexpected shifts, by new dangers wearing unfamiliar faces but inherently no stranger than the past. When the positive forces within humans grow strong, violence is pushed from the center of life. But at the same time, society faces unprecedented challenges, from technology and politics to individual psychology. There are times when seemingly absolute safety is precisely when latent dangers silently accumulate. Developing technology makes information spread faster, but it also transforms toxic words and extremist seeds into waves that sweep away reason. A call to action, an image, a rumor can ignite hatred on an unprecedented scale. New forms of violence emerge, requiring no fists or bullets, but using psychological pressure and social isolation. Online violence are powerful enough to force humans back to their most primordial instincts. No one dares to claim peace is inevitable. Progress is not guaranteed by power, but is the result of continuous efforts to protect and nurture what is good. Each generation must ask itself what it will do when faced with new challenges. The instincts of possession, the desire for control, conflicts of interest, they are all still there, merely cloaked in different guises. Even if society becomes more tolerant, no one can afford to be complacent. A single moment of carelessness can drag society back to dark days where violence reigns and empathy vanishes. The future is not for those who are self-satisfied with past achievements. The old stories of war, revenge, domestic violence, and discrimination all serve as reminders that history always has the potential to repeat itself if positive forces weaken, if a few generations forget. What seemed impossible to return can resurface in unexpected forms. Therefore, every step forward is the result of perseverance, of continuously questioning, of constantly scrutinizing oneself and society. The value of peace lies not in the absence of conflict, but in the ability to resolve conflict without resorting to violence. Humanity's maturation is demonstrated by the increasing number of problems resolved through reason, dialogue, mutual understanding. Empathy is no longer a privilege of the few, but has become a solid foundation for relationships and sustainable social institutions. Law, media, education. All contribute to creating an environment where violence becomes rare, condemned, and tightly controlled. There is no guaranteed path to a nonviolent society, but it can be certain that only by nurturing the positive forces within each individual, by building strong institutions, by honestly and courageously confronting both the darkness and the light within ourselves, can humanity protect the achievements of thousands of years of evolution. The better angels are not gifts from above, but the result of training, of the will to overcome instinct, of the ability to look far ahead and accept change for the common good. If there is one greatest lesson from history's long journey, it is that the decline of violence is not a miracle, nor is it an immutable privilege. It is the fruit of countless small choices made by millions of people, every day, every hour, across this world. Just one moment of oversight, and everything can crumble. But with persistence, however slow, peace can be sustained and strengthened day by day. It is in this fragility that humanity truly recognizes the meaning of freedom, of compassion, of responsibility to future generations. And so, history continues to write new pages. No one knows what challenges await. But one thing is certain: light and darkness always coexist. The only difference is what we choose to nurture within ourselves and in our communities. This is not just the story of one nation, one era, but the common journey of all humankind, where each person plays a part in determining the future for everyone. Not everyone is willing to look at the true nature of history and acknowledge the dark parts within themselves. But only by facing it without avoidance can humanity fully grasp the depth of a world that is both beautiful and full of uncertainties. What remains after this book is not praise for what has been achieved, but a reminder that every peaceful accomplishment is the result of resilience against destructive instincts, the fruit of wisdom that sees far, and the courage not to shy away from correcting mistakes. Perhaps you once believed that as society developed enough, violence would automatically disappear. But if you read through these stories, you will surely realize that darkness never completely yields, but always seeks to return in new forms. It is time for each person to ask themselves, if one day the world around you changes, will you choose to be part of the light or surrender to the darkness when faced with injustice? Will you silently turn away, or will you dare to speak up, even if only with a gentle word? Peace is not a state of rest, but an unending task. This story is only truly meaningful if continued by action every day.